Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the Delaware Association of Realtors Annual Legislative and Regulatory Forum. This is our chance to report to you on all that has happened over the last year and a half, the key legislative and regulatory takeaways from the 152nd legislative session, and to give you a preview of what may come next year. My name is Cheryl Crow, and I'm the chair of Delaware Association of Realtors Public Policy Committee. I'm joined by Jamie Clough, DAR's Director of Government Affairs, and we've had an extremely busy legislative session over the last year and a half. This meeting will be recorded and uploaded onto the Delaware Association of Realtors website. Later on, you will hear from DAR's legal counsel, Andy Taylor, about regulatory updates. But first, we have an update on what NAR is working on at the national level. We are joined by our political representative from the National Association of Realtors, Dara Dudinsky. If you have any questions for Daria, please enter them into the chat and we can address them at the end of her presentation. Daria, the stage is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Am I able to share my screen for some slides? Oh,
yes,
here we
you
go.
should be able to now.
Wonderful. All right, let me just get set up. All right, thank you so much for having me here today. I am your political representative for the state of Delaware. So I act as a liaison between your government affairs shop in Delaware and the government affairs team here in DC that works strictly on the federal level. So let's get right to it with the federal legislative update. Thought we'd start out with a bit of a look back. In recent months, we saw a lot of wins for the industry. First being, as a result of NAR's advocacy, the FHA reduced mortgage insurance premiums, MIPs, by 30 basis points, which significantly helps new and low to moderate income buyers. NAR also spearheaded the introduction of new bipartisan legislation, the Direct Seller and Real Estate Agent Harmonization Act, and this harmonizes federal statuses to reduce uncertainty and minimize regulatory burdens for independent contractor real estate professionals. NAR also successfully pressed congressional leaders to extend the National Flood Insurance Program through this November 17th. You may remember our call to action last November, where we activated thousands of members to make tens of thousands of contacts with members of Congress. So thank you again for that effort. That was really amazing. NAR estimates that 1,300 real estate transactions are affected each day by extending the NFIP lapse. Lastly, a big win was our legal action on rent control and property rights. NAR and other industry groups filed an amicus brief in support of the Supreme Court's review of two cases that challenge New York rent control and stop government actions that exacerbate existing housing shortages and affordability problems. So I thought we could now look at our current priorities. The first being ADU support. NAR supported recent action by the administration to update policies on accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, as a means to create additional housing inventory and more opportunities for homeowners. The Federal Housing Administration, or FHA, will now allow buyers to use actual or potential rental income of an ADU when qualifying for an FHA insured loan. And we are laser focused on three bills specifically right now. And the first would be the More Homes on the Market Act. You probably heard about this one at our mid-year meeting in DC. We are still very focused on it. So I'm sorry if this sounds repetitive, but this is a super important bill to us. This would raise the capital gains exclusion We successfully advocated for the introduction of this bill that's bipartisan. It would incentivize more owners to sell their homes by doubling the maximum amount of capital gains a homeowner can exclude on the sale of a principal residence, and annually adjust that for inflation. This would unlock a significant segment of inventory that was previously unavailable to buyers. Two other bills we are laser focused on is the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act and the Affordable Housing Tax Credit Improvement Act. Both expand housing development. NAR has been a strong advocate of these two bills, both of which are designed to significantly increase the number of homes available for lower and middle income families. So the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act would attract private investment for building and renovating as many as 500,000 owner-occupied homes through tax credits. And then the Affordable Housing Tax Credit Improvement Act would improve the low-income housing tax credit program, which we all know is a huge aspect of housing affordability in our country right now. And this would allow for the creation of over 2 million additional affordable homes over the next 10 years. So in the House, both these bills are introduced and they're being referred to House Ways and Means. Luckily, there is a Senate companion bill for the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, and the Senate Banking Committee is holding hearings right now. And fortunately, Senator Coons is a co-sponsor on that, so we love to hear that. And moving on, lastly, shifting gears to the regulatory front, fair housing is always a priority here at NAR. We mobilized a coalition of real estate groups to issue a statement in support of HUD's affirmatively fair housing rule. The proposed rule, which encourages data-driven local solutions to housing segregation. So this includes a new emphasis on homeownership opportunity. All right, switching gears to some very recent updates from June from last month. You have probably been hearing a lot about VA compensation issues, and this is one of our only issues that has a very, very recent update. So I wanted to focus on that for a second. So currently, the Department of Veteran Affairs prohibits veterans from using VA loans to directly compensate their realtor. And as you can imagine, this creates serious disadvantages for veterans in an already limited market. Since our mid-year meeting, 2 letters from the House have been sent to the VA, directing it to clarify how they're going to solve this issue. Quite a few updates here. Luckily, language has been inserted and approved into the House Appropriations Committee text for next year's budget to examine how the VA home loan program will be affected by our change in commission structure. The bill has also been drafted called the VA Home Loan Reform Act, and it has been brought before the VA Subcommittee on Economic Opportunity. So as you can see, NAR has been trying a try everything and see what works approach. We've been throwing a lot of things up in the air, trying to resolve this issue. And we're happy to report that just 3 weeks ago, the VA agreed to temporarily remove their prohibition on buyer broker compensation. So they're going to temporarily allow veterans to compensate realtors as they determine what their formal rulemaking process will look like here. So legal is reviewing this announcement. We have a lot of technical questions on this front, but long story short, this is a win. This is a great win for us. We are still in contact with senior staffers at the VA. They said the rulemaking process likely won't take place until 2025 or 2026. We did get a real sense that they might be eyeing caps. Senator John Tester, who chairs the Committee on Veteran Affairs, has come a long way on this issue. They are open to our ideas on VA home loan reform. Senator Warnock is likely introducing a Senate companion bill to the VA Housing Loan Forever Act. And we have, of course, been in contact with him, seeing how we can be helpful on this front. So unlikely that anything moves at the end of the year. They don't expect markups or legislative hearings for the remainder of 2024, but we're in a good spot for next Congress. This is definitely a win for us. Another big update I wanted to touch on is the newly formed Congressional Real Estate Caucus. Just some background in case it's not common knowledge. Caucuses are voluntary membership organizations in Congress that pursue shared legislative goals. They may also be called coalitions, study groups, task forces, or working groups. They do differ from committees, which are smaller groups who can vote and oversee agencies. But nonetheless, caucuses play a significant role in how Congress addresses policy issues. So we are very excited about the formation of the Congressional Real Estate Caucus. This is a bipartisan group who care about policies that impact our industry, whether it be housing affordability, availability, technology, commercial issues. For any FPCs in the room, it's always great to mention this new caucus when you're meeting with your lawyers, because we'd love to have new members join. So very exciting update there. So pivoting from the legislative and regulatory front, I thought we could do a quick elections update. Wanted to include some great stats we have on RPAC. You all may be familiar with our win rate last cycle, which is 97.9%. Just an incredible stat there, and really a testament to our state and national trustees who take their job very seriously and pick very strong candidates to support. A reminder of our bipartisanship, 50% goes to each party. And we know this is a tough thing to come by these days with a lot of chaos on the Hill. So we are very proud of our bipartisanship. And lastly, the number of federal candidates we supported last cycle, which was 418. So really, really a lot going on and work that we're certainly proud of. Looking ahead, what we can expect in 2024. 34 senators are up for re-election. A whopping 20 of them are Democrats and 3 are independents who caucus with Democrats. So the Senate will be very, very challenging for Dems. There is a big question of whether or not they can maintain control of the already slim majority that they have. And as you know, one of these Senate seats that Dems are trying to defend is right here in Delaware. Tom Carper's retirement opens up a Senate seat. This is a very safe seat for Democrats, though, with Lisa Blunt Rochester as the favorite. And as you may know, the Delaware RPAC endorsed Lisa Blunt Rochester back in January. So very strong candidate who has been a co-sponsor on several pieces of legislation for us. So we're glad to have a friend coming into that role. Right. And there's a similar question of whether the Republicans can maintain control of the House. So similar situation Dems are facing in the Senate, Republicans are facing this in the House. They have a lot of districts to defend here. Right now, there are 22 rare, what they call purple congressional districts, or a district where the race is considered a toss-up and highly competitive. So you'll see Democrats and Republicans focusing a lot on these districts, spending significant resources here. As you know, Delaware has another open seat this cycle. It's at-large House seat. The seat is also rating very safe for Democrats. The frontrunner being sitting state Senator Sarah McBride, who is very far ahead of the crowd, especially now that Delaware's State Housing Authority Director Eugene Young has stepped out of the race. And for the next slide, I thought this was just a great outcome analysis by National Journal. So clearly the presidential election is still being viewed as a toss-up, but what I thought was very interesting is both outcomes that are rated high likelihood include Dems taking the House and Republicans taking the Senate. So very exciting stuff. We can guess that there will likely be thin margins for both parties in both chambers after November, which really creates significant challenges when it comes to passing legislation. And on top of this, we're seeing a lot of wave of retirements right now. About 28 Democrats have indicated they won't seek re-election. Meanwhile, 14 Republicans have said they are also not seeking Republicans. So Dems are really on the defense right now, as they're feeling the effects of those retirements in very competitive districts. And of course, the 2024 presidential election is in full swing. We are in the middle of caucuses and primaries this summer. And 2 weeks ago, there was the first presidential debate. I wanted to take this moment to dispel any rumors that often resurface at this time. NAR does not endorse presidential candidates in the race. We stay completely out of that. So I just wanted to give a little reminder there. And I'm happy to take any questions if we have time for that, or here's my email on the screen. You can also email me any questions you have.
That's great. Thanks, Daria. If any questions pop up about NAR's advocacy efforts, please send them to Daria or Jamie, and we'll get them answered. Thank you.
Of course, and I will pop my email in the chat as well.
Perfect. This brings up our state legislative overview. But before we get into the details, I want to take a moment to thank all the members of the Public Policy Committee, state political coordinators, task force members, major investors, and those that took the time to answer our calls for action. With 96 bills reviewed, sorry. We wish they were removed. 29 committee meetings, 3 calls for actions, numerous task force meetings, testimonies, all of this in Legislative Hall. Our Public Policy Committee has been very involved with legislators, advocating for home ownership and private property rights, and our work would not be possible without all of your support. So we thank you for that. If you haven't already, please text the word realtors to 30644. This is the best way to stay updated and be alerted to all of our calls for action, and your participation has a significant impact on our advocacy efforts. If you want to be more involved, SBCs serve as an in-district point of contact with their elected officials, and they play a key role in getting our message out. So I highly encourage you to reach out to Jamie about becoming a state political coordinator in your district. With that, I would like to now turn things over to Jamie Clubb for an overview of the legislative session and our advocacy efforts in Delaware. Go ahead, Jamie, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Cheryl. Thanks for everybody for hopping on. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Jamie Clough. I am your Government Affairs Director for the Delaware Association of Realtors. As Cheryl has alluded to, we've had quite the busy legislative session. But before I get into all the nitty-gritty details, I do want to give a big shout out and thank you to both our chair, Cheryl, and our vice chair, Bobby, for all the incredible work that they've done, helping us keep our heads on straight and pointing it in the right direction. We had a lot of sporadic impromptu committee testimonies and meetings and Zoom calls. And so I just want to say thank you so much for all the efforts that you have done to help us do the work that we do. But moving on to getting an overview of our legislative efforts here. We always start with our guiding principles, those being improving access to homeownership and protecting private property rights. Those are the two guiding posts that we have whenever we're looking at legislation, as well as focusing on housing inventory. Our underlying message has been that the root cause of the high cost of housing has been just a general lack of inventory. So whenever we talk about housing issues, increasing inventory should be on the top list of priorities of how we improve our industry. Expanding a bit more about the lack of housing, just some stats here for you. At current interest rates of 5% down payment, a medium-priced home carries a monthly payment of $3,400. For a family making the median income in Newcastle County of $90,000, this represents 64% of their take-home pay. And these are numbers that are provided by the National Association of Home Builders. And then 24% of the total cost for a new home can be directly traced back towards costs tied towards regulation, permitting, or permitting delays. So these are the areas that we have been promoting as areas of focus when it comes to conversations about housing. If we want to actually lower the cost of housing, we need to increase the supply of housing. According to the DSHA 2003 Housing Needs Assessment Report, Delaware needs 24,000 new housing units by 2030 to keep up with demand. So we're a little bit behind the ball here. Some key legislation that took center stage this legislative session was the short-term rental tax. I'll go into more detail about that, but we've been fighting that for a very long time, and as the bill was making its way through, we realized that it was becoming much more of an uphill battle than was winnable, and so we decided to work with the sponsor and turn it into a version that we think is absolutely better than the version that was introduced, and I'll explain those differences in a little bit. The next big issue we had come up was around the issue of protected class, particularly when it comes to housing status. There were two bills that were introduced to affect this issue. House Bill 439, which pertained to real estate, and then House Bill 440, which pertained to employment. And I'll go into detail about those two bills in a little bit here as well. But I also wanted to touch on the Realty Transfer Tax and the Housing Production Task Force. We were not able to lower the Realty Transfer Tax this session, unfortunately. That is still a very high mountain to climb, and there's a lot of opposition towards reducing it. We had two bills introduced that would have reduced the tax, HB 36, which was primarily introduced by us. It was bipartisan, and it would have reduced the tax immediately by 1%. That bill did not move forward. Same as House Bill 381. This is a bill that was a bit more of a measured approach. It would reduce the tax by 0.25% every year over a span of 4 years. So ultimately, it would have reduced the tax by 1%, but it would have just done it over a longer period of time. Unfortunately, that bill did not pass either, but it did get farther than our previous bills have in the past, so that is encouraging. The other two bills I wanted to mention are SB 225 and SB 120. These bills revolve around using revenue gathered from the realty transfer tax and putting that back into the housing industry, allowing affordable housing units projects, to use those funds, as well as providing exemptions for projects that build affordable housing units. And then I will expand a bit more on this as well. The Housing Production Task Force was passed this year. Housing issues, the cost of housing, the lack of inventory is becoming more center stage in Delaware. We're seeing a lot more bills being introduced revolving around the issue of the cost of housing. And this task force was created to analyze the issues when it comes to how do we produce more housing, how do we change our zoning laws and regulations to affect that increased construction. And we will be very involved in that going forward. So details on the short-term rental lodging tax. So at the very beginning, the tax started out at 8%. And to clarify, this is a tax on the guest, not a tax on the owner. The tax started at 8%. They classified any rental lease less than 150 days would qualify as a short-term rental and thus be required to pay this tax. The original bill required all owners of properties to get a license, as well as that the collection of the tax starts at the first payment. So upon a reservation 6 months before the actual stay, that was when the tax would be collected. So introduced a whole bunch of issues when it comes to cancellations, refunds, all that fun stuff. And it would have been effective immediately upon passing. So taking all of that, we met with the primary sponsor of the bill, as well as the hotel lodging lobby and the Department of Finance. And through countless meetings, we were able to negotiate to this final version. The tax will be 4.5% on guests. A short-term rental is considered any rental lease 31 nights or fewer. And only accommodations intermediaries are going to be required to get a license. So the way that would work is if you are a brokerage, you would have to get a license. And if you owned a short-term rental, excuse me, you yourself would have to get a accommodations intermediary license, or you would have to have a contract with somebody who has an accommodations intermediary license. So this was a compromise with the Department of Finance as a way to limit the number of licenses that have to be distributed for short-term rentals. And lastly, the point of collection for the tax was changed to either the final payment or the beginning of occupancy is when the tax would be collected. So that makes it a lot easier for when you're dealing with cancellations, reservations, all that fun stuff. And then there were concerns about reservations that had been entered into before the bill was passed, and if those would be affected by the bill being enacted. And so there was a provision included to make the effective for reservations entered after January 1st, 2025. Moving on, we have housing status as a protected class. This came from a bill that was being called the Homeless Bill of Rights. It was being passed around, it was being worked on since last year, and it had faced a lot of opposition because it was very overarching, very sweeping. Police organizations, municipalities, housing providers had problems with the Bill of Rights, with the Homeless Bill of Rights. And so these two bills kind of grew from the ashes of, if you will, of the Bill of Rights, the Homeless Bill of Rights, excuse me. HB 439 pertains solely for housing transactions, stating that a tenant or an applicant current housing status cannot be used when determining the viability of their application. This was specifically asked for by us and by the Delaware Apartment Association, excuse me. We wanted to make sure that landlords were still able to look at housing history, evidence of evictions, criminal past, all the things that a landlord would normally use to look at a tenant for their viability. And so we had an amendment included that changed the definition from housing status to current housing status, as well as a provision that says landlords are able to use whatever information they normally would, not explicitly mentioned in the bill, for reviewing their candidates. And then HB 440 is the very similar bill, except it pertains to employment. All right, so looking ahead for 2025, we had quite a few bills that were introduced that we were able to prevent or to let the legislature rethink and rework. One of them being rent escrow. We were able to talk to the primary sponsors of the bill, and they admitted on the House floor, saying that, yep, it seemed this bill will be harmful towards landlords and will be harmful towards the housing rental industry as a whole. And so they tabled this bill. They were trying to work on a way and see what amendments they could sneak through at the last minute, but they realized that that would be biting off a bit too much that they could chew. And so rent escrow was tabled before the end of session. We are expecting that some version of rent escrow will be introduced next year. And so we are in conversations with those sponsors to preempt any conflict that might occur about that. Same thing with rent escrow. Big thank you to all of the members that participated in our emergency call for action over the weekend last week. The bill was introduced on Friday, and it was not voted on in committee on the last day of session, which was that Sunday. So there was a fast turnaround with this bill. It seems that our message has gotten across that rent control policies do not help the housing market. And we are very proud and thankful for you all in your efforts for helping us prevent that bill from passing. Wetlands reclassification was an issue that we addressed this legislative session. There was a bill that would have had sweeping changes to wetland conservation and classification. We were asked to join a workshop along with the Home Builders Association, the Apartment Association, farmers, climate change activist groups, anybody who has a stake in wetlands. And through those meetings, we learned that this is quite a large issue and that we did not have enough time to fully work through the new reclassification before the end of the session. So this bill was tabled, and so therefore did not pass this session, but we are expecting to come back to it over the summer and winter, and we will see something like that coming next year. Same with the Housing Agreement Advisors Bill. For those of you who don't know the details, this bill would have made it so that during a rental or a for sale showing, a house showing, a potential buyer or tenant would have the right to have a quote unquote housing advisor and again, quote, reasonable number of housing advisors join them throughout the entire sale process. We had concerns with the lack of clarity and definitions in the bill, and we were able to postpone this bill from being considered, but we do know that this is a passion project of the primary sponsor, and we are expecting this bill to be reintroduced sometime next year. Along with the Homeless Bill of Rights, I mentioned this earlier, remnants of the bill that did not make it through are likely to be reintroduced next year, so we are going to be keeping a close eye on that. And then the last point I wanted to talk about is the Affordable Housing Production Task Force. We are very excited about this task force coming forward. The crisis of our housing situation is becoming center stage and starting to get the attention it deserves. This is a 20-person excuse me, this is a 20-person task force. Our CEO, Wes Stefanik, has been added to it. So we have direct representation on the task force, and we'll be heavily involved in these discussions. And the ultimate goal of this task force is to examine both local zoning regulations, best trade practices for producing more housing, and then to produce a report with recommended legislation or regulatory changes to the General Assembly and Governor for their consideration, hopefully for legislation to be passed next year. So we are very excited for this task force, and we have more to come with this. So that is the extent of my legislative update. If there are any questions, I would ask you to please type them into the chat, and we can save them for the end of the session here. But right now, I think what I will do is I will stop sharing my screen, and I will hand things over to Andy Taylor, who is our legal counsel for the regulatory update.
Thank you, Jamie. Welcome, everyone. Good to see so many people on the presentation here. And you can see my screen, right? Excellent. Okay, so this should start at the top with my name. Is that right? You seeing the correct screen? All right, good, excellent. You all know me as Andy, but that's my full name right there. Still call me Andy. So a couple updates following on other things mentioned. On ADUs, there was a bill pending on the state level about that. Newcastle County has a proposed ordinance that they're having hearings on about ADUs, accessory dwelling units. This would remove the cap of 400 that was put in place when ADUs first came about in Newcastle County. The original concern when they started ADUs in Newcastle County was that there'd be a sudden explosion of all these ADUs and be a burden on communities. They've never reached the cap of 400, so they're going to do away with that cap and reduce the lot size for detached ADUs from 2 acres to 1/2 acre. This doesn't entirely address the question of community deed restrictions, so we're still likely to see some efforts on the state level about this. The DeKiowa flow chart, I will be updating that for the July 1st 3% increase in the dollar amount that applies to planned communities, not for condominiums, but other planned communities. Next year, there will probably be a proposed bill to reduce the dollar amount back to the original $500 without there being an annual increase of 3%. This will allow more communities, cause more communities to come within DeKiowa and have the requirement of the resale certificate, which is helpful to real estate professionals and the public to be educated about communities. The Real Estate Commission is working on revisions to their education modules and education rules. DAR is very well represented on that committee of the Real Estate Commission. So that's good. Just a reminder to you, we are in another renewal cycle, and the broker's responsibility includes being sure licensees complete their continuing education, and if not, the broker will be fined and issued a reprimand or more severe discipline. It seems the only way to avoid this is to terminate a licensee prior to April 30th, not May 1st, after they just couldn't get their computer to work up till midnight on the 30th to renew. You have to terminate them prior to April 30th and communicate that to Division of Professional Regulation, the Real Estate Commission. The commissioners are well aware of the limitations of the functionality of DelPros. We are all frustrated by that. We wish Delaware had things that other states have, like Maryland, where the schools, after teaching a course, just go on the system and input the licensees' names and license numbers for their effectively to be 100% audit of education. But Delaware does not have that functionality. And I know DAR has worked very hard on trying to have them have that in some way, but has not come about yet. We are very pleased that the real estate commissioners themselves are more engaged with issues than they have been in a while. They are taking up participation in ARELO, that's the Association of Real Estate Licensed Law Officials, with everything happening on the national level. We think is critically important at that time, so they're able to bring more information back to Delaware to help us learn from things on the national level. I was very pleased that the Real Estate Commission sent a letter to the General Assembly regarding the Housing Advisors Bill, expressing their concern that if passed, the housing advisors could be providing real estate services for which a license was required, but being an unlicensed person, and could also be providing what appeared to be advice in other regulated fields such as appraisers, home inspectors, wood destroying insect inspectors, etc. So they provided that letter signed by the chair of the Real Estate Commission, who is currently a public member doing a very good job. So under the signature of the chair of the commission, that went to all members of the General Assembly. So that's excellent that they chose to become involved that way. So I'm going to, you'll see this is not an Andy off the cuff presentation. And yes, you can read it on the screen if you want, but I'm going to go through it with you because there's not a whole lot else that happened on the regulatory front, but there's a lot happening on the national level. So I thought it would be helpful for me to go through with you a review of the way that I see the NAR proposed settlement in the antitrust cases being analyzed under Delaware law, specifically sections and questions. And so the March 15th announcement of the proposed settlement agreement in the antitrust cases started blowing up all of our phones that morning. Yes, we were as surprised by it as you were. The NAR directors did not need to, nor were they given an opportunity to vote on that. It was not needed, evidently. And obviously they have some delicate settlement discussions and timing and whatnot, as in any legal action. So the state association and local associations and Bright MLS are covered by the settlement, as are individual licensees and companies. Well, most, but not all, but mostly. Now, my work on agency law in Delaware began around 1984. Those of you who are not math majors, I think that's 40 years. So our first agency disclosure statute and rule came about in 1991. We had significant work on elements for statutory agency in Delaware that came to an outline of a proposal in 1994. We worked on it culminating in the 2006 statutory agency bill, HB 122 as amended, signed by Governor Minner with this pen. So then we had statutory revisions in 2012. So I estimate on statutory agency in Delaware, we worked on it for 14 years. We now have 4 months to figure out and implement the current required practice changes. So your patience, your understanding, your input are very much appreciated. The Real Estate Commission is considering a possible revisions to the Consumer Information Statement. They're going to discuss it again this Thursday at the commission meeting, and that is to put a provision into the CIS, which I think is terrific because, as you know, that's the state-provided form, has a state seal on it. The public should view that as an authoritative source to say broker and agent compensation is not set by law and is fully negotiable. There's not a standard commission. You, meaning the member of the public, should discuss compensation and the scope of services to be provided for such compensation with your real estate agent early in the process. Brokers can set their own compensation and fees based on what services are offered and their business model in the competitive marketplace. To protect your interests, it's recommended you enter into a written agency agreement outlining your real estate agent's duties as well as your rights and responsibilities. There's a lot packed in there, and I think you'll see when I go through current Delaware statutory agency law, I think we're really very well set for this in Delaware at this point. Now, Bright MLS has updated their rules. They have a new form. You've probably seen those, all of that going into effect by August 14th. and the definition of the MLS through NAR that has changed through the years. What you see on the screen is the current definition of the MLS. I remember attending the NAR annual meeting when buyer agency was first coming about, and in one national meeting, they made over 40 changes to the NAR Code of Ethics, taking out anything that made it appear that you as a licensee, as an agent, were only representing the seller, to make it more of a level playing field and to recognize that buyer agency was becoming much more of a common practice. Now, a licensee is not required to be a realtor to be a participant in the Bright MLS, and that was not required for the prior listing service, which was called Trend, since 2002 as a result of a lawsuit that had been filed in Pennsylvania. I'm sure your broker and managers are talking with you about your company policies. That's critical. And practice changes according to the proposed settlement must be implemented by August 17th, 2024. The DAR Forms Committee, we thought we were finished with the listing agreement and the buyer agency representation agreement. Then the Department of Justice served the California Association of Realtors with a CID, a civil investigative demand concerning their forms. So we postponed the effective date of the new forms. The Forms Committee is meeting again this Thursday. I believe the week after that as well. We'll continue to meet until it's done. I saw at least 3 members of the Forms Committee on the meeting today. I saw Bruce Plummer, Bobby Schlegel, John W. Ford, Camilla Conlon. So I saw at least 4 of you there. And so that committee has representation from all 3 counties, and we very much value your input to that. I'm going to give you more of Andy's thoughts, current as of today, about how the proposed antitrust settlement is and my understanding of the DOJ's position on the issues, how that is implemented in the context of Delaware Licensing Act. This is not legal advice. Any thoughts expressed are mine alone, not those of DAR or the sponsors. Isn't that the typical kind of disclaimer, right? Your broker will be consulting with your company legal counsel. And in my view, Delaware law already handles most of the questions very well. As we work with all this, though, there will probably be some statutory changes and rule changes that will become apparent. I'm not licensed as a broker or salesperson, so I try to be a good listener to you, to understand what you are encountering in the marketplace. Your questions are valued. Some of the questions already asked during the presentations that Bruce Plummer and I made on the forms are already informing our final refinements to the forms. I hope that the DOJ files a statement of interest in the NAR proposed settlement like they did in the Massachusetts no-select PIN case. We have studied that as well as the Forms Committee. We're informed about that. Unfortunately, though, we won't know that until well after we're required to make the practice changes in mid-August. So please continue to refer to facts.realtor and other updates. Please continue to send me emails, news articles, forms from other states, et cetera, et cetera. Don't worry, I don't charge DAR, every minute for reading those things. I try to be kind on that, but try to stay updated myself with all of that. So let's take a look more about how Delaware law is set up for this. And then I'll end up with talking through how I see this playing out as we go forward and how I see it working really, I think, pretty well for you in the competitive marketplace once we get on board with this. So we have Delaware law allows compensation from the listing broker to the buyer's broker without further consent to the seller, but the proposed antitrust settlement requires seller consent. So what you see on your screen, Title 24, Section 2930 on compensation. So this is from the Licensing Act. It does say brokers or brokerage organizations may compensate other brokers or brokerage organizations participating in the transaction without further permission of the party. Also says that nothing in this chapter prohibits consumers from entering into written brokerage agreements with a broker or brokerage organization, which contains duties, obligations, or responsibilities in addition to those specified in this chapter. So Delaware law is already very well set up for the competitive marketplace based on how you and your company view your value proposition in the marketplace and what you will be offering to the public and what your compensation structure will be. However, this will need seller consent. This is from the NAR FAQ, question 51. Must participants acting for a seller obtain prior approval from the seller before an offer of compensation is made or paid to another broker, blah, blah, blah. Yes, the practice change requires you to disclose to the sellers and obtain seller approval for payment or offers of payment that the listing broker might make to another broker. And that has to be made to the seller in writing in advance of any payment or agreement to pay another broker. Note that was added May 29th. So the settlement was March 15th, May 29th. Yes. So NAR continues to update the FAQ. NAR continues to have discussions, I think as recently as last week before, with Department of Justice attorneys, trying to further refine and understand the implementation of all this. So we thank them for that continuing effort, and we're working as best we can to keep up with all that. Now, Delaware, as you know, has a presumption of representation and consent to dual agency. This goes back to a 1983-84 Federal Trade Commission study by the Federal Trade Commission that essentially found that the member of the public felt, rightly or wrongly, felt that the agent they were meeting with represented them in the transaction. So we thought, well, if that's what the public thinks, let's make the law match the practice. So we have presumed statutory agency in Delaware. The licensee working for the buyer is presumed to be a statutory agent representing the buyer. Licensee working for the seller is presumed to be a statutory agent representing the seller. And a licensee working for both is presumed to be a statutory agent representing both parties as a dual agent. So as you know, Delaware law allows for single agent dual agency. I think that is in the interest of the public to keep that as a choice. It does not mean the member of the public needs to agree to it, as you know, and we are also well aware of and we're studying the Consumer Federation of America reports that have been issued about the CAR buyer agency agreement report issued June 25th. Seller listing agreement report just released July 2nd. So we, the Forms Committee, we're studying those as well, trying to keep their comments in mind. They're critical of dual agency, but I don't think in Delaware that should be taken away from the consumer as a choice. It should continue to be allowed as a choice. And as you know, the member of the public can opt out of that on the consumer information statement. Right from the statute, the presumption of agency may be rebutted by the consumer signing a CIS establishing a different agency relationship. We have the specific statutory provision about the beginning of duties. In Delaware, I think a real hallmark of our law that's worked very well from 2007 till now is the duty of confidentiality that begins upon first contact, and then this statutory provision about commencement and termination of your other duties, unless the CIS is signed indicating there's no agency relationship. So Delaware law does already contemplate the member of the public could choose representation, could choose to go with the presumptions, could choose to opt out of the presumptions, could choose to not be represented, which I don't think would be advisable. I'll mention in a minute, but there is that choice now for the consumer. So I think those choices should continue to be offered to the consumer, with you explaining those things to the consumer and getting their informed understanding of that. Therefore, if you are in a situation, if a potential buyer does not want representation, well, have the buyer sign a CAS indicating you do not represent the buyer. But that leads us to the question, whom are you representing, if anyone? If you are the designated listing agent, then you're only representing the seller. If you're not, then is the seller offering seller sub-agency as a choice? Now, this does, as you know, create additional liability for the seller, And this additional liability was part of the reason why Delaware statutory agency tries to avoid having seller sub-agency because of that liability. It's interesting, back when we were working on this decades ago, the Secretary of State in New York State, she proposed abolishing seller sub-agency completely. Oh, you should have heard the uproar at the NAR meeting. Oh, how can she propose that? And we need that. Well, actually, she was very much ahead of her time. That seller sub-agency, in my view, is not really in the seller's best interest. It does create additional liability for the seller. And now if seller sub-agency is not offered, then you're not representing either party. But then it raises the question, what can you really do? How much can you do without creating an unintentional agency relationship with the buyer? If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck. So this is another thing we were trying to avoid when we first worked on the statutory agency in Delaware. That was unintentional implied agency relationship. We were trying to remedy that problem by the Delaware statutory agency and having the presumptions of agency in place. Now, more from the NAR FAQ for you. Does the requirement for a written agreement with a buyer mean that MLS participants and buyers must enter into a written agency agreement? No. Did you hear my emphasis on the word agency? It requires an agreement, but not a written agency agreement. So they'll still be able to enter into any type of professional relationship permitted by state law. NAR policy does not dictate what type of relationship you have, the term of the agreement. It can be 1 day, 1 month, 1 house, 1 zip code, 1 type of property. It can be limited to ministerial acts. I just love that they use those words. And by the way, we borrowed those words from Maryland when we were decades ago working on our statutory agency. Can be limited to a certain number of showings, negotiations, presenting offers. Our law in Delaware is already very well set up for a menu for services type of business model, if that's what the broker wants to offer. NAR does not obviously dictate anything as far as compensation. It can be a dollar amount, a flat fee, a percent, an hourly rate, whatever the company policy is and their business model. So my thought here, it's better for the buyer to choose to be represented by a buyer's agent, because the duties of a buyer's agent under Delaware law can be as limited or as extensive as agreed to in the agreement with the buyer. And so I think that's why, through a buyer's agent explaining this to a buyer should be able to understand, okay, here's what you're offering, here's the compensation that goes along with that. I want that full suite of representation, or I don't. Can we talk about something less? Is there some different compensation that could be for different things? Because in my view, it would be very hard to show a house without the buyer asking a question. And what's going to happen? You're going to unlock the door and then say, all right, you go ahead, look around. I'm going to sit at the kitchen table. Today I've got the green tea with pear and jasmine. I'll just sit here. You go look at things. Oh, you're not going to come with me? Oh, well, no, I don't represent you. I unlocked the door for you. That's what you paid me to do. Oh, well, what do you think about this? Well, I'm not your agent. I'm not giving you advice. Well, so I think it's much better for the public, have a 1-day buyer representation agreement if that's, what works in the circumstance. And that way they can have your representation, which I think is in that public members of the public best interest. Now we have a duty to cooperate, which was very carefully negotiated by me. And with the approval of the Antitrust Division of the U.S. Department of Justice in 2005, 2006. Yes, it did take 2 years. They gave approval then with a letter that was sent to me by certified mail, return receipt requested. I even saved the envelope. So we have their approval for our section on duty to cooperate, which was all part of the statutory agency bill that was pending at the time. And so it does allow for require cooperation, but not compensation, unless that's not in the best interest of the member of the public. Say licensees shall cooperate with all other licensees involved in a transaction, except when cooperation is not in the customer's or client's best interest. So, most all the time it's going to be in their interest to cooperate, but you are not required to offer the full suite of brokered services. There can be a menu for services type of model. And so that was all fleshed out in this section. All right, how about open houses? Delaware law on this, section 2938, the CIS is available to consumers at open houses, but does not need to be personally presented by the licensee unless the consumer asks for more than factual information about the property or expresses an interest in making an offer on the property during the open house. Now, from the NAR FAQ, question 60, if you host an open house or provide access on behalf of a seller only to an unrepresented buyer, will they be required to enter into a written agreement with those buyers touring the home? No, because in this case, the MLS participant's only working for the seller, not the buyer. The participant does not need to enter into a written agreement with the buyer. However, remember, we have the presumption of agency in Delaware. I'll get to that in a minute. So then question 56, the practice change requiring written agreements with the buyers triggered by two conditions applies if you're working with buyers and touring a home. So they give us information from the FAQ about what it means to be working with a buyer as opposed to simply talking to a buyer like at an open house, or providing an unrepresented buyer simply with access to home that you have listed. Now, so if you are the listing agent, buyer just wants you to, they contact you to see the house. Sure, in that case, I mean, you could give them a CIS, make sure they understand, I don't represent you, I only represent the seller. The buyer says, yeah, that's why I contacted you. I don't want or need representation, I don't think. I just want to see the home. Let's go look at it. Okay, well, here's the CIS. Just make sure you understand then that I'm only representing the seller. Yeah, and then in that case, you're walking around with the seller. You're the salesperson for the seller, trying to make the sale on behalf of the seller. You're not needing a buyer agency or buyer agreement with that buyer because you're representing the seller. And so that in that case, you're not working with the buyer. What's it mean to tour a home? That is that you are entering the house, includes doing it virtually as well. And a home is 1 to 4 family residential dwellings. It's not covering other than that. So not covering what we loosely call, commercial transactions. So therefore, think some before opening the door for an open house. Decide in Delaware if you are going to offer buyer agent representation to potential buyers who come through that house, working then as a disclosed dual agent, or if you're not. So just make that decision before opening the door for the open house. You're going to have some company policies on that probably as well. And then you can use the CIS accordingly if the potential buyer is asking for more than factual information about the property or expressing an interest. So I suggest by the door at the open house, you have your sign-in sheet where the buyer probably gives you a fake phone number and email address, right? And you have your pile of CIS forms there so they can pick those up. And then if they ask you for more than factual information, or they express an interest in making an offer, that's when you can sit down at the kitchen table and talk with them, make sure they've seen the CIS, talk with them about agency, confirm whether or not they're working with another agent already, and then act accordingly. So just some thoughts here about working with sellers and buyers. And I think an accurate way to think of this and describe this to members of the public is that agents are paid from the transaction. I mean, you think about it, for years, the sellers might think they were paying for the compensation because it was on their side of the numbers. Yeah, but ask a buyer whose money's on the table. It's the buyer's money on the table, right? So from a buyer's point of view, the buyer's been paying all the agents. So really, I think it's more accurate to say they're paid from the transaction and from the value that you create in your involvement with the transaction. And I think you create a lot of value of that. And Bright MLS issued a report updated for last August that confirmed that for their on MLS report. Now, so yeah, during the listing presentation, just a few thoughts here in a very, overview way, just trying to focus more on the antitrust and agency part, not everything else you do during a listing presentation. So you're discussing with the sellers that buyers may make an offer asking for the seller to contribute toward the buyer's settlement expenses, seller concessions. Make sure the seller understands this is not required by law. It's not required by the MLS. It's fully negotiable. Ask the seller, will you entertain an offer with the buyer asking for seller concessions? This does not mean the seller must agree. It's just part of the negotiations within an acceptable offer. Do not discuss this as compensation to buyer's agents. The buyer can apply seller concessions to whatever they want as settlement expenses. I'll get back to more about this in just a minute. So the seller does not need to agree to the amount of seller concessions to offer. Help the seller to understand that what matters to them is their net bottom line, and you will help them compute that to compare net estimates for competing offers. That's part of what you do as a listing agent. Ask that the seller, this is just Andy talking here, and I'm not a licensee, so you do this much better than I would. Ask the seller that they not tell you the lowest price they would consider accepting. They might say, well, why is that? And you might say, well, you want to sell your property, right? Well, sure, that's obvious. That's why I'm hiring you. Well, tell them under Delaware law, I might have a buyer. You've got a buyer? That's great. I want to sell, bring that buyer to my property. Yeah, and in Delaware, that's allowed by the disclosed dual agency. So I might be representing the buyer as well under our disclosed dual agency. Wait a minute, you might be representing the buyer? Well, yeah, if I have a buyer, you want to sell your property, I might be bringing them to the property to potentially make an offer. And our Delaware law allows that. Go over that with them in the CIS because that clearly lays out what you must do and the things that you may do and how the dual agency works. Again, I think in Delaware, this disclosed dual agency works well for a couple of particular reasons. The duty of confidentiality right from the get-go. We are small, and buyers are still represented by Delaware attorneys, so they have that independent representation there as well. If the seller doesn't want the dual agency, well, then tell them, well, that's okay. Still, don't tell me the lowest price you might consider accepting. If I have a buyer who might be interested in making an offer on your property, I can have my broker designate someone else in the office to represent the buyer, and we can keep it separate that way. So then checking off yes or no on the listing agreement for seller concessions. Now, under the Bright MLS rules, as they've released them now, the place to put a percentage or a dollar amount is an opportunity. But I think we're probably not going to end up with that being part of the new listing agreement. It's not necessarily, and in my view, actually complicates things. The Department of Justice, it's clear through the statement of interest that they issued in the No Select Pin case and other comments since, and I've read the transcript of that recent hearing from Massachusetts. The Department of Justice, they just don't want there to be discussions between the listing agent and the seller about what the seller might offer in the way of buyer compensation. And I see, machinations that people are going through now saying, well, how are we going to find out about this? And, oh, we'll have to go on that listing broker's website to look to see the information for only their listings. We'll be calling, we'll be texting, we'll be emailing before we set up a tour to find out if that seller's offering compensation or not. How cumbersome is that? To me, it seems an easier, more straightforward procedure to tear off the Band-Aid, as some states are calling it, and just have the listing agreement say yes or no. Will the seller consider an offer, offering seller concessions, yes or no? Not need to talk about the dollar amount, not need to have all that communications or attempted communications before setting up the tour. It's really not necessary. You'd be reviewing the CIS and the listing agreement, all your other company forms, as well as your listing presentation, and then, going about marketing the property and what you're doing there. Okay, so then your buyer counseling session, plead with the buyer to allow you the time to be a professional and educate the buyer. No more of this calling at 10 after 2 and saying, hey, this just popped up and can you show it to me at 3 o'clock? Well, if you've never heard from them before, you haven't met with that buyer, either in person or by Zoom, that's going to be very cumbersome. So really plead with the buyer to allow you the time to be a professional and educate the buyer. Review your company's buyer agency representation agreement, which does not need to be the DAR form. As you know, DAR offers forms as a service to our members. They are not required, they're optional. Reach an agreement with the buyer as to what services you're offered and compensation prior to touring homes. Make sure the buyer knows the compensation is not set by law or the MLS and is fully negotiable. That's some of the magic language from the antitrust settlement agreement. Make sure the buyer knows the buyer can make an offer in which the buyer asks the seller to pay for seller concessions to be applied towards the buyer's settlement expenses, but the seller is not obligated to agree to pay seller concessions. That buyer agent compensation is just part of the settlement expenses. Educate the buyer that, similar to on the seller side, what matters to the buyer on the buyer side is not the net, but the gross amount the buyer will pay at settlement. And you will help compute estimates of that as part of your buyer making an offer and evaluating counteroffers. You'll have the buyer be pre-qualified by a mortgage professional, so you will have an estimate of the closing costs from the lender. And, you can adjust that some based on the price range and, with the offer being made. And then similarly to what I suggested for the seller, ask the buyer to not tell you the maximum they would offer for a property unless the listing agent indicates, hey, this is the time you need to put in your highest and best offer in order to compete with other offers. Explain to the buyer again why that is, part of the reason being that if a counter offer came back at exactly the price, the maximum that buyer had told you they might pay for the property, what's the buyer going to think? The buyer's going to think you told the listing agent that. So just tell the buyer, don't tell me. That way you can never think that I told it to somebody else, unless we're in a situation of your highest and best offer needing to compete with other offers. Discuss dual agency, and will the buyer agree to dual agency, or do they want to opt out of that? As you know, that can change for particular properties, can go to consent to dual agency, not consent to dual agency, it can change back and forth. You'd be reviewing and signing the CIS, reviewing and signing your company buyer agency representation agreement and your other company forms, set up the tour, represent the buyer according to the terms of your agreement. So that's just, I know that you do a whole lot more than that, but I just tried to focus on what are some of the steps that could work under this proposed antitrust settlement as we currently understand it, which could change next week the way things are going. That's just, we've been struggling with this as much as we can, just like you've been struggling with it. As I said, we had 14 years before, now we have 4 months. So we're doing the best we can. Here's for you from Rhode Island. They've gone with a tear off the Band-Aid approach. And in their draft new listing agreement, they have their compensation paragraphs for what the seller is agreeing to pay the listing broker, and then simply this: seller initial, other fees. Compensation is not fixed by law and is fully negotiable. That should sound familiar to you by now, right? The magic language from the settlement agreement. A potential buyer may ask seller to compensate a broker who is assisting or representing the buyer or to contribute to the buyer's closing costs as a condition of the buyer's purchase of property. Any such agreement must be in writing. That's it. They don't even have the yes or no field. They're just telling the seller buyers might make an offer that way. They don't have fields to fill in for an amount of seller concessions as a percentage or a dollar amount. Just simply telling the buyer, hey, I'm sorry, telling the seller buyers may make an offer that way. As I said, I think that's actually simpler than trying to go through some things that we see if we went with the approach of seller concession, yes or no, and then having to have the discussion about, well, how much would you offer seller? And then buyer's agents trying to get that communication to them, all of that before even setting up a tour. This tear off the Band-Aid approach seems to me to be more straightforward. It certainly seems to me 100% in line with the settlement agreement, 100% in line with what the DOJ approach seems to be they're indicating. As I said, I really hope the DOJ does file a statement of interest in the NAR settlement agreement that we're discussing here to give us further guidance about implementing it. My experience with you all, you realtors, fantastic people through the decades, has been, Andy, tell us the rules, we'll follow the rules. Don't have all this gray area here. Tell us the rules, we'll follow the rules. So I really hope the DOJ does file a statement of interest to help guide us as to what the rules are, what they want the rules to be, help us get there. They helped us back in 2005, 2006. Help us get there. Let's have clear rules, be able to explain those to the members of the public, and be the good brokers that you are. You do such fabulous work representing the public. You bring such value to the transaction. You know how complicated real estate transactions are. It's not like walking into a hardware store and trying to pick out a hammer. I think some of you heard me say that before in education classes. You know how complicated it is. You know the member of the public needs your assistance guiding them through that transaction, and don't minimize that value. So what about amendments to existing listing agreements? Should active listings, meaning you don't have an offer accepted yet prior to all this taking effect, be amended? Yes, and the DAR Forms Committee will be working on a sample amendment form to your active listings. And that further goes along with this from the NAR FAQ. Should active buyer agreements entered into before the policy changes be amended? Yes, or just it might be simpler to just enter into a new buyer agency agreement with your active buyers. Does the settlement agreement require objectively ascertainable and not open-ended those requirements? Does that apply to listing agreements or the compensation sellers pay listing brokers? No. So unlike the settlement agreement requirement, the compensation and buyer agreements has to be objectively ascertainable, not open-ended. Listing agreements can be structured however the seller and listing broker agree, so long as a listing agreement complies with the MLS policy and specifies the amount or rate of payment from the seller to the listing broker. We had some questions about this during the presentation that Bruce and I gave on what we were thinking was going to be our release forms, which, as you know, we postponed when the DOJ filed that CID on the California forms. But we heard your questions, and we'll be looking at that again within the listing agreement. What do these practice changes mean for commercial transactions? Basically nothing, because they're not working with 1 to 4 family residential transactions. They're not working through the Bright MLS system. They have their own different commercial information exchanges, and they've been doing for decades basically what you'll be doing now, with that buyer agent compensation being negotiated with the buyer and negotiated with the seller and negotiated as part of the transaction. So I think that you can deal with this. And so we are figuring it out as we go in Delaware. And I think that will be, very helpful as we go. As I said, continue to send your questions, continue to send your comments, continue to send all the information you've been finding and sending. That's very helpful. And don't be that person out there on social media spouting off. That's going to be Exhibit A. B, C, Exhibit 1 through number 1000 in the next antitrust case. In the Consumer Federation of America report issued on July 2nd, yeah, they have footnotes. They have footnotes that have some of your social media posts right there in their report being critical about what's going on now, about people trying to figure out, oh, basically, how are we going to get around these rules? What are we going to do? Let's have some other aggregator, web services and this, that, and the other. Don't be doing that. There's already been, how do I say? Hints, that's the right word I'm looking for there, hints that the next avenue of antitrust cases will be against form providers. Well, we're doing our best to make sure DAR is not one of those defendants in an antitrust form provider case. That's why we're studying everything as we go. That's why we put our forms on hold when the Department of Justice issued that CID against California Association of Realtors. So we're trying to do our best to comply with all this for Delaware. So once again, we appreciate your patience with this, your understanding. Keep those questions coming. Speaking of questions, I don't know if we have any others in the chat that people would like us to go through.
Yes. That's a fantastic segue there, Andy. We do have one question. Can we have a company policy that we will not show a home without a signed CIS and buyer agency agreement?
That's your company policy on what you offer for your buyer representation services. If what those services are that you're offering, that's memorialized in your company agreement, that can be your company policy. That doesn't mean the buyer has to agree to that. But that if that's your company policy, here's what we offer in the way of buyer representation services. Here's our company form that explains about that. Here's the state of Delaware consumer information statement that's consistent with that. Then that's what you can do as your company policy.
Okay, that was the only question that we had. Cheryl?
That's
Come
great.
on, come on. I didn't answer everything. I'm sure I didn't. So
Well, Andy, you're a wealth of knowledge, so we certainly thank you for everything you do for the association and for all of your assistance when we have questions like that. So we certainly appreciate all that you do for us and all the information and all the challenges you help us overcome. So certainly thank you for that, and thank you for taking time to spend with us today. So this concludes our legislative and regulatory forum. Thanks everyone for attending and supporting our advocacy efforts. If you have any questions or would like to learn more about how to get involved, please reach out to Jamie and he'll be more than happy to help. Jamie, his email is available on our website, but I think it's in the chat somewhere. If not, Jamie, maybe throw it in the chat.
I'll put it in right now.
Yeah, that would be great. Looks like Andy has a point, but he's on mute.
one more point on that, Cheryl. The housing advisors bill that Jamie reviewed, our understanding is that came about from one member of the public in Delaware complaining to their representative that there was a landlord who wouldn't allow that potential tenant to bring somebody with them to review and sign the lease. That's all it takes in Delaware, folks, is one person complaining to their representative or senator. We don't know all the circumstances of that. We don't know if that was something justified or unjustified as to why the landlord or agent took that position. But please, please, please think real carefully when you're dealing with any member of the public, and keep in mind that's all it takes. One phone call. This is little Delaware. One phone call by one constituent to their representative or senator, and we're dealing with a bill. We're dealing with the real estate commission involved with it. We're dealing with countless meetings and hours of work on that. So think real carefully when you're interacting with the public in Delaware. Thanks. Sorry, Cheryl, I couldn't resist throwing that in. And please, as Jamie said, become more politically involved. As Cheryl said, become more politically involved. Funnel all that through the DAR Public Policy Committee and Jamie and Wes and all the good folks at DAR. We can speak with one realtor voice. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Very good points. And with that, we will close for the day. So thanks, everyone, and enjoy your day.
Thank you, everybody.